Welcome to this session on mobile patterns. In this session, we'll discuss what are mobile patterns and where did the patterns come from. We'll also find where we can go to learn more about these patterns. Now, there are a number of different categories or types of patterns, so we'll look at a few examples of the adaptive patterns, the content patterns, the interaction and navigation patterns, the number patterns, and the utility patterns. So let's go ahead and get started. What is a pattern? A pattern is a collection of elements that creates a reusable block. And before we mentioned that a block is something that we can use to set up a container to define whatever we want. So a pattern is actually just a way of creating a reusable block where we're not defining a block, it's just a pre-existing mobile pattern. So if it's pre-existing, then why are these pre-existing specific patterns created, and why did we choose these? Well, if you remember back in the SilkUI overview, there was an analysis of common popular websites, and those sites seem to use the same types of widgets and patterns over and over to display different types of data. In certain situations, there are patterns or widgets that are the de facto standard for showing or displaying different types of data. Now, when we create these patterns, many times people are wondering, are we stuck with the patterns as they are, or can we extend them? And they are changeable and extensible. So patterns are something that we have control over. So when we think about a mobile application, there is a screen that holds a lot of different information, and if we break that up, there are a number of different patterns or ways in which the data is being displayed. Sometimes there are cards full of data. That card may have a background with some sort of tag on top of it or some icon related to something that's going on. We can have different types of cards and buttons, and then different types of floating actions that affect what's happening. So in general, these different types of components of mobile apps should be different types of components that are reusable. So it'd be nice if these different pieces that exist were reusable UI blocks, and they looked good, they performed well, and they were available whenever we needed them. So when we did our introduction to SilkUI, we said that you could go to the silkui.outsystems.com website, and you could find out information about SilkUI itself, the templates, the samples, the patterns, and overall how to interact and work with SilkUI. So in this particular case, we're focusing more on the patterns, which are the reusable, customizable elements. And for mobile, there are over 60 of those, and for web, there are over 70. So here are the list of all of the mobile patterns, and there are quite a few adaptive patterns, content patterns, interaction, and these are some of the ones that we mentioned in the topic overview. So if we go to the SilkUI website and you begin looking at the list of the different types of patterns, when you go to adaptive or others, you can see something like the progress circle. And a progress circle gives us the ability to see some percentage of a circle that's available and then actually get that part of, or that percentage of the circle filled in with a particular color as well. So it's a nice way to visually display the progress of some sort of activity, and it works well when you know the percentage of what's been done. So it also can be done with an animation so that you see it draw and you see a little bit of action to go ahead and draw your attention to that progress circle itself. Now, what are all of the different types of mobile patterns? Well, there are lots of them. And we mentioned that when you go to look at the mobile patterns, if you look at the mobile patterns in the elements area, you'll see that they're created in their categories, and then inside their categories there are all of the different parts of that category. So for the adaptive patterns, we have things like different columns and different ways to change what's being seen on the screen. So it can adapt the display depending on the type and the amount of data that we have. So here we can see the 3-column display, breaking things into 3 columns. We can see the column small left, where we have 2 columns and we have a small one on the left and the bigger one on the right. When we have these types of adaptive patterns, they adapt because if we look in their properties, we can decide whether or not to use a gutter, which is the space in between the different columns. And then we can also choose how to break things when we're using the phone in portrait mode, when we're using the phone in landscape mode, a tablet in portrait mode, or a tablet in landscape mode. And to do that, we can either break all, break first, break last, break middle, or break none. So here with the 3, if we were to do break first on the phone, then we would go ahead and if these got to the point where they were too big, it would keep the first one by itself and then leave the other 2 separate. The same thing would happen for last, except it would keep the first 2 together and make the last one last. If there isn't enough space, it might make sense to break them all so that the columns don't really exist and they just stack. You could try to break in the middle, but since we have 3, that doesn't work particularly well. Or we could set break none and say that they can't be broken. We want it this way, and if it looks bad, that's fine, it looks bad. So knowing these adaptive patterns and what they can do can be very helpful because we could actually change the behavior of how it will look on the phone versus how it will look on the tablet without actually having to create 2 different versions of the application itself. Now there are more adaptive patterns besides the columns. There are also things like the gallery, and then there's things like master detail. So there are a lot of interesting ways that the adaptive patterns can display data so that we can kind of organize what's being shown on the screen a little bit better. Then there are content patterns. And the content patterns, you can see there are quite a few of them. Many of them have to do with cards and displaying information in a particular area. Flipping that content back and forth, floating it, having sections that we can handle, or being able to show certain types of information, certain types of content in a particular way. Some of the most popular are shown here. The blank slate, which shows nothing when we're trying to retrieve data and there's a chance that there will be no data for us to display. Then we need something sort of in the background to show that, and we can use a blank slate to do that. A card item just shows information on a card and allows us to divide up the card into different spaces. And then we also see the chat message, where if we have some sort of interaction between users, it can help to use this chat message to go ahead and show that interaction. Some of the other content patterns, list items, so being able to create the list and having the list item inside of that is very useful. Being able to place tags like the UX, UI, Sketch, and Photoshop tags seen here can be very helpful. And then having a user avatar. So it's nice to be able to go ahead and have something that can display information about the user and make that reusable and sort of standard across a number of different widgets. There are also interaction patterns. So interaction patterns change or allow us to choose different types of things. So here we may have a button that opens up the action sheet, and the action sheet lets us go ahead and whatever was here, we can flag it, we can mark it as unread, or we can delete it. So the action sheet gives us the ability to do some sort of action on whatever we were working on. Calendar lets us select some dates, and the carousel shows us a number of pieces of information or graphics and images, whatever it might be, and then we can see how many of them there are, and by swiping left and right, we could go ahead and move through that particular carousel. There's some more interaction patterns like sliders, where we might have ranges and numbers of guests. We may wish to be able to do a search, so there's actually a bit simplistic, but a way to go ahead and set up a default search. And then there's a set of stacked cards, where we may see one particular card and then we could delete it or say it's important. And the second we do an action to one card, the next card pops up because it's just a stack of cards that happen to be there. There are also navigation patterns. Tabs can be very useful. So here we see 3 tabs across the top that can show us the different to-dos, the ones that might be done, all of the to-dos that are out there. And we can also see a timeline where we just see a different set of events or times and when those types of things occurred. And we can also have a wizard where we may have multiple steps that need to complete to do something, and we'll see what step we're actually on and the type of information we need for that step. There are also number patterns just to show us an indication of how many of something we have, how many things are in our inbox, how many of them are for James. So badges can show us a number inside of a badge. Progress bars can show us the percentage of how much something is complete. And then we talked about the progress circle a little bit earlier to go ahead and show the circles for the progress that has occurred. And then we have utility patterns. So we have a center content. So if we have information that may not take up the whole screen, but we want it to be centered, we can go ahead and do that. We may wish to add a swipe event to something that might not typically have a swipe. We can add a swipe event to anything that we would like to, and it will sort of contain and become part of other things that are on the screen. And then we can also do vertical alignment so that we make sure that the checkbox and the text line up properly to go ahead and make it look a little bit nicer. So these utility patterns can improve the overall user experience. So in this session, we wanted to introduce the mobile patterns, give a little bit more information about what they were, an example of some of these patterns. As we mentioned in the SilkUI overview, if you want more details about this, the best place to go is to the website where you can find all of the details about this, including being able to download or preview it so you can understand more about that pattern. So that's it for this session on mobile patterns.